Hello.
It is so good to see you all here. I want you to know that we've been looking forward to this moment when we could not only take care of women's history, but also what just happened in the past month of February with Black History. So I'm very pleased to see that we are joined by so many people who are very, very interested in talking about women and the history of women and what has been happening in recent years. Before we do that, I would like to welcome all of the members of the committee. So can we start with Ms. Beatty?
Well, first, Madam Chairwoman, thank you for doing this. Thank you to our esteemed witnesses being here today and all of those who are gathered to be in the audience. When we talk about Black women, when we talk about Black history, it's Women's Month, economic, that's synonymous with Chairwoman Maxine Waters.
Right. Amen.
Let me just say how excited I was to see the invitation for us to come. When you talk about history and making a difference, it will go down because history is watching us. That it was Chairwoman Maxine Waters who was bold, courageous enough to say, not just to us and to Black Americans, but to the nation, I will have a subcommittee on diversity and inclusion so we can make sure that we talk about equity. So I thank you for allowing me to be here. I thank you that she also had enough confidence that I was the first ever subcommittee chairwoman of diversity and inclusion. And a few months from now, we're just gonna have good news because that will be our chairwoman of the powerful, iconic, prestigious financial services. With that, I yield back.
Thank you so very much. And now, I will ask Ms. Williams to please say hello to everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chairwoman Waters, because I will continue to call you that until we get you that gavel back in your hands. Y'all, I'm Congresswoman Maxine Williams, and I proudly represent Atlanta and Georgia's fighting 5th Congressional District. Happy to have constituents here today, and this conversation is so critical and important for me because Atlanta continues to be in the top when it comes to the racial wealth gap. And so when we have people that are fighting, that are doing something, that are leading the way to address these disparities, we have to stand up and stand with you. And so the attacks that are going on, not just in Atlanta, not just Georgia, but across the country, this is the committee, this is the leadership. Chairwoman Maxine Waters stands with you every day, and she leads us to make sure that we are not just having conversations like this, but we have policies to back it up. So when we put that gavel back in her hands, it's gonna be a new day, y'all. Thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wow, you can see we're ready. Thank you so very much again for being here, and I welcome everyone. I want to thank you all so very much for your attendance here today at the Financial Services Committee's Women's History Month Roundtable and your collective commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the financial services industry. In 2019, when I became the first Black person and first woman to chair the committee, I created Congress's first ever subcommittee on diversity and inclusion. Our work on this subcommittee exposed inequities in America's housing and financial system, published unprecedented data on diversity and inclusion in the financial services industry, explored policy solutions to address these challenges, and put pressure on companies to make changes to advance racial equity. Through 3 in-depth reports, dozens of hearings, and thoughtful legislation, Democrats led the charge for more diversity in the financial services workforce, corporate boardrooms, and beyond. And our efforts were always driven by the evidence which clearly shows that companies with more diverse executive teams perform better financially than teams that are not. Unfortunately, after winning the majority in the Congress last year, one of the first things that Chair McHenry did was to eliminate the subcommittee on diversity and inclusion. This decision was just the start of an all-out attack on DEI in our committee. And of course, it is not just in our committee where we're seeing this kind of backlash on the progress and public awareness of DEI. Extreme MAGA Republicans are using this same playbook all across the country, and one of their most effective and potent tools is the legal system, starting with the Supreme Court's reversal of affirmative action in higher education. Conservative groups like America First Legal are behind several pending lawsuits to undermine the programs aimed at closing the racial wealth gap and providing people of color with access to spaces that they have been historically excluded from. The Fearless Fund, which is the first Black woman-run venture capital firm solely dedicated to funding women, is currently being sued for its grant program. Morgan Stanley and Progressive Insurance Company are currently facing lawsuits for their DEI programs. The Minority Business Development Agency, which is the sole federal agency that exists to promote the growth of minority-owned businesses, and which I helped to codify in 2021 as part of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure legislation that has been ordered to serve white majority-owned businesses in addition to minority-owned businesses by a federal judge in Texas. That's not all. Republican state attorneys general are using the Supreme Court ruling in the SFFA v. Harvard to go after Fortune 100 companies, warning them against engaging in DEI in their employment and contracting practices, claiming that these practices are illegal. In response, I sent a letter to the financial services companies in the Fortune 100 CEOs urging them to resist the intimidation tactics and carry on with their DEI efforts. DEI initiatives have been effective at giving underserved communities a more level playing field to excel and accomplish professional and economic success. This is called equity, not reverse racism. For those who claim to care about America's global economic power, they must understand that fighting for a more equitable future through DEI initiatives is critical to the economic well-being of all Americans. Women and people of color need inclusive, intentional, and genuine representation. Fortunately, there are a number of nonprofits and other women-focused organizations and women leaders like the ones on this panel today rising to the challenge and expanding opportunities for women and people of color. These 4 women here with us today are resilient, authentic, and aspirational. Despite the challenges they face, they are relentless in their efforts to build a more robust pipeline of upwardly mobile women of color, uplifting the next generation to look beyond the status quo to what is possible. Thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us today, and I look forward to having an insightful and impactful conversation on DEI. I would like to remind members that today's roundtable is open to the public and will be live streamed. I'm very pleased to have with us today Arian Simone, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Fearless Fund, the nation's first venture capital firm founded by Black women that invests exclusively in companies owned by women. The next person on this panel is Angela Rye, Principal and CEO of Impact Strategies and renowned social justice advocate, and my daughter, which I have to disclose to everybody. The next is my sister, Laura Murphy, civil rights expert and president of Laura Murphy and Associates, LLC. And finally, Dariely Rodriguez, Deputy Chief Counsel for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, where she works strategically to advance racial justice. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so very much. Ms. Simone, I will go to you first for your opening remarks.
I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be here. I'm Arian Simone. I serve as the CEO and founding partner of the Fearless Fund. And as you stated, the nation's first venture capital firm built by women of color for women of color. I'm honored to be here today. We were recently, as you stated, sued for alleged discrimination, which was beyond disturbing to me. The plaintiffs filed 3 things against 4 of my companies: a preliminary injunction to stop one of the grant programs, a lawsuit itself, which is the complaint, and a temporary restraining order to put us out of business by August 17th, 2023. We got the temporary restraining order withdrawn, and we have been in court fighting the preliminary injunction, and we are waiting for the appeals court to issue a ruling if we can continue our program or not.
Well, thank you very much for getting us started here. And next, I'm going to call on Ms. Rye for your opening remarks.
Okay, mine will be closer to 5 minutes. Can you all hear me? Yes. Yours was loud and I can't hear mine. Okay, here we go. You want it? No. I had a little bit of feedback. In fact, I'll give you mine. Good afternoon to every member of Congress present, to the staff. I have to say it is amazing to see a dais full of women of color in Women's History Month and right on the heels of Black History Month, and to be sitting at this tremendous table next to my mentor, someone who I couldn't wait to meet, and a very brilliant attorney. The theme of this roundtable was countering attacks, and I think in order for us to get into what it really means to counter attacks, we have to understand how the depth and the breadth of these attacks are, the scope of these attacks. So we understand that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion are being attacked on multiple levels: the public sector, the local, state, and federal level, the private sector, and in education. And if we're honest, I think we can acknowledge that this didn't begin with MAGA. MAGA is merely the Frankenstein of the Republican Party, and it has been in existence for a very long time. I am biased to the West Coast, and so the 2 examples that I have of a well thought out intentional attack is where I'm from. In Washington in 1998, there was Initiative 200 to reverse affirmative action. And in California, which I'm partially from, in 1996, there was Proposition 209. I am not celebrating these, I'm just merely stating that they have been planning this for some time. And unfortunately, those who are progressively minded have been caught on their heels despite seeing these attacks for some time. So from access to health care to affirmative action, from Stop Woke to Alabama Senate Bill 129, from hair to history and what they've deemed as our handouts, from access to health care to affirmative action, from venture to voting rights, and federal contracting to the Fearless Fund, we are facing unprecedented attacks. The American Alliance for Equal Rights to America First Legal, they've been striving to take us to pre-1950, which is when most folks who support the Make America Great Again agenda say America was at its best. Pre-1950. They've been striving, I would argue, to take us back even further to right before Reconstruction. And I think the thing that we really have to address is that the real elephant in the room with us is equity. The fact that they cannot bear to see us be on equal footing. It's not that the attacks or discriminatory practices are new. They do seem to, though, be testing the standard, which is intention, and they're testing that standard with all-out viciousness. Anti-DEI on the state level is hitting us in more than 30 states with more than 100 measures. Many of these have been passed, yet to be implemented in several ways, but at least 8 of them have been implemented. And again, we know the most recent is Florida and Alabama just last week. What is remarkable to me is that while we were in the midst of a pandemic, as we all know, we watched our dear brother George Floyd be murdered on camera for 9 minutes and 30 seconds. And in the moment where people were forced to look at it and not look away because there was nowhere to turn in the midst of a pandemic, what we realized, or I think we all knew, but what most of America had to realize and come to terms with is the fact that the pandemic wasn't just coronavirus. It was also a decades and centuries long battle with racism. 400 years to be exact and counting. While the response was a good one, relatively speaking, of course there were convictions on the criminal side, but corporate America, the public sector, turned to what happened after George Floyd and said, we have to do something. So we were met with $60 billion of commitments from corporate America, which later turned to $340 billion in commitments. And now, as equity is under attack, most of them could not wait to get out of those commitments without being accountable even to what they said they would do. They were like, you know what, we'll throw this aside because we never wanted to do it anyway. And at some point, we got to get out of this white guilt. It is really uncomfortable. So now we are still experiencing the impacts of the most brutal boomerang effect. And despite us having every right to get our companies funded, to be paid equitably, to be sitting in boardrooms, occupying board seats, and in the C-suite, and of course to sit in classrooms, we are experiencing another unprecedented attack in the highest court of the land, thanks to someone who also benefited from affirmative action, Clarence Thomas. I wish it was funny. I really do. But if we built the table and the chairs, I see no reason why we should have to ask for a seat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rye. We will go next to Ms. Murphy for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Having worked with you for many years, I know how hard you fought for justice, equity, and inclusion, especially in your leadership role on the House Financial Services Committee. Thank you so much for all that you have done for our nation. I'm here to discuss three things. One, civil rights audits as distinct from corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Two, what civil rights or racial equity audits are designed to do. And three, why such audits make business sense. Civil rights are rights guaranteed and protected by the U.S. Constitution, federal laws enacted by Congress. They are designed to combat discrimination, guarantee equal opportunity and equal protection under the law, and to stop harm based on race, religion, age, sex, disability, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other categories. Our civil rights laws apply both to government action and the actions of businesses. The Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard weakened the use of race in college admissions, but it did not invalidate our civil rights laws or the reasons for their existence. Civil rights audits are designed to go far beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. DEI functions in corporations are often relegated to internally focused human resources departments. Individuals in those departments do not have the power, oftentimes, for example, over whether a bank locates branches in low-income communities, steers subprime mortgages to people of color, or uses biased algorithms to grant small business loans. A civil rights audit is a holistic examination of significant civil rights and racial equity issues that may exist in a company both internally and externally. Auditors with civil rights expertise assess a company's business practices, policies, products, and services to determine if and how those components perpetuate discrimination. The auditors work with the company to issue a public report to, hold on one second. The allergies are getting to me. Thank you. They issue a public report to provide a blueprint for concrete corrective action and to ensure that structures are in place to implement changes and prevent future civil rights harms. I conducted pioneering civil rights audits of 2 U.S. corporations. The first was for Airbnb in 2016, and the second was of Facebook from 2018 to 2020. My reports for both companies are available online. After those audits, I also wrote a report in 2021 outlining how civil rights audits should be conducted, entitled The Rationale for and Key Elements of a Business Civil Rights Audit. And that's also available online. And I have to digress because this wonderful leader put Mark Zuckerberg on the firing line, asked him if he even knew my name, and that kicked the civil rights audit of Facebook into much higher gear. Your oversight role in Congress is stupendous, and I'm grateful to you. And it led to real changes in settling lawsuits having to do with advertising bias in housing, employment, and credit. So you've had a great impact through these audits, so thank you. I had to say that. Some 30 corporations have engaged or are in the process of engaging in civil rights audits. These have come about because of pressure from a variety of sources, including consumer complaints, social justice groups, members of Congress, and shareholder activist funds. Many shareholder proposals for racial equity civil rights audits met with success in the 2022 proxy season, but they saw a precipitous decline in 2023 in terms of the number of proposals and the level of support for them. The shareholder advocacy group Majority Action has just issued a report documenting the major asset management firms that have reversed course on civil rights and racial equity audits, people like BlackRock, groups like BlackRock. Corporations and asset managers that turn their back on civil rights audits are abandoning their responsibilities to shareholders and customers, and I would argue abandoning their fiduciary responsibilities. Businesses and stakeholders need to confront the challenges resulting from our country's legacy of systemic racism and other structural forms of discrimination. When problems of corporate discrimination go unchecked, it leads to legal, political, reputational, and operational problems. It hampers productivity, it turns away consumers, and it weakens workforce talent. While I would love businesses to conduct civil rights audits out of the goodness of their hearts, conducting such audits should happen because they make business sense. As the nation's population becomes more people of color than white by the year 2050, and as companies try to expand to diverse global markets, problems like systemic racism only hamper market access, productivity, and profitability. Multicultural populations will only expand in influence. It is essential that corporate America face and fix discrimination issues for their businesses to survive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go to Ms. Rodriguez for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. I am Dariely Rodriguez, Deputy Chief Counsel with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And last year, we know that the Supreme Court held that the UNC and Harvard's affirmative action programs, which considered race as one factor of many as part of a holistic admissions process, violated the Equal Protection Clause. The Lawyers Committee represented multiracial groups of students and alumni from UNC and Harvard. The Lawyers Committee is the only civil rights organization that litigated both cases since their inception, and was also the only organization that presented oral argument in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's ruling undermines equal opportunity by significantly limiting the circumstances in which race can be used in higher education admissions. However, even before the ruling came down, at the Lawyers Committee, we started thinking about the implications of a negative ruling in areas outside of higher education admissions. We knew that fallout from the decisions had the potential to undermine race-conscious and racial equity programs across industries. And unfortunately, our prediction was true. Since the ruling, there has been a coordinated attack on workplace efforts designed to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. This backlash, as many have already stated,
comes after corporations made unprecedented commitments to advancing racial equity after George Floyd's murder in 2020. Interestingly, recent analysis shows that in 2021, among 88 companies in the S&P 500, 94% of the increase in the headcount went to people of color. So this shows that when you put pressure on businesses, they really start analyzing and start making progress. We are now seeing rollbacks in this progress. In response, the Lawyers Committee has launched a comprehensive strategy to combat fallout from the adverse rulings and subsequent attacks in other sectors. I have been personally deputized to oversee this cross-disciplinary strategy, which has included engaging in impact litigation. For example, we led the civil rights amicus brief in the Fearless Fund case, engaging in extensive policy advocacy, as well as outreach and education to various sectors, including the corporate, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors, about how to navigate this moment and how to continue advancing racial equity in legally defensible ways. We've also executed a Protecting and Advancing DEI Pro Bono initiative, the goal of which is to provide free legal advice to entities that are eligible in partnership with pro bono law firms so that they can obtain the advice that they need to continue their critical racial equity initiatives. In advising various entities engaged in efforts to advance racial equity, we know firsthand the immense impact that these programs are making on the lives of Black people and other people of color across the country. And in speaking with leaders from various sectors, I know personally that there has been a strong inclination to overreact to the attacks to DEI programs and voluntarily roll back such critical efforts. We cannot do our opponents' work for them. Employers still have a duty, an affirmative duty, to prevent and correct discrimination in the workplace. We at the Lawyers Committee have been urging employers to not retreat from their DEI efforts and instead to continue pursuing all that is possible under the law to advance equity. Why? Because Black communities continue to suffer from persistent and systemic discrimination, including in the workplace. Occupational segregation continues to leave workers of color. And today, on Equal Pay Day, worth noting that in particular, Black women and women of color are overrepresented in lower paying and higher risk jobs. We have been urging businesses to stay the course because we know that DEI programs advance equity and inclusion, and these programs are good for business, they're good for workers, and they benefit our entire country. In this moment, we applaud the work that you all are doing to hold companies accountable, to ensure that they continue to do this work. And we ask Congress to continue to push back against the overcorrection and the overreaction that we are seeing across industries. We ask that you hold hearings and briefings to highlight the systemic barriers that Black workers and workers of color continue to face in the workplace, and to highlight lawful employer and corporate policies that have been successful in minimizing these barriers and creating more inclusive workplaces. We also call on Congress to make clear that programs that advance racial equity are not discriminatory, but instead they are necessary for our country and the economic well-being of all of our communities. Finally, we call on Congress to ensure federal anti-discrimination agencies have the appropriations that they need to forcefully combat systemic discrimination across sectors. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address these issues.
Wow, thank you so very much, all of our panelists, for your opening statements. I would love to have had the time to spend a few days with you talking about the issues in the way that you have had to confront them, whether it's talking about how do you amass venture capital, whether or not a young, brilliant lawyer who has worked in the streets of Los Angeles with gang members have the time to give to this effort, given any career that you could have chosen. Why someone who is a civil rights leader, having led the ACLU, is still doing it and working at civil rights issues. And hello, how are you? Good to see you. Mr. Cleaver is here. Please welcome him also. And Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for using your lawyer skills on behalf of all of us and dealing with an issue that confronts us today that's been identified by everybody that requires so much work and so much commitment. Thank you all. Let's give them all a big round of applause. Now, I would like to open up the Q&A portion of our roundtable with a few questions, and then we're going to call on other members to be recognized for any questions they may have. But before I do that, I think that Mr. Cleaver should have an opening statement also. Please.
Thank you for being here.
Give him a round of applause for thanking you, okay? Thank you. All right, Mr. Cleaver, I'm going to go right to a couple of questions before I turn it over to the other members here. Republicans have spent years perfecting their playbook to roll back racial progress through concerted attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Unfortunately, these efforts to strip power from Black communities are making headway in the face of a widening racial wealth gap and heightened inequality. We should be deeply concerned about what this means for the economic opportunities for people of color. Ms. Rye, what do you think about that?
If I can, Chairwoman Waters, I would like to yield my time to this brilliant venture capitalist to my right. I believe this format is a little different than normal, so I want to make sure she has the opportunity to be heard too. She has a lot of wisdom, and so I want to defer to her first, if that's okay.
Well, thank you very, very much. Go right ahead, Ms. Simone.
No, thank you, and she is definitely correct. Had I known I had more time, Chairwoman Waters, I would have took up all the time. Yes, when it comes to venture capital, the disparities that exist in this space are very alarming. Black people collectively receive less than 1% of venture capital funding. The industry I work in is a $62 trillion industry. The investors are 92% white male. I do believe that if we can diversify the investors, we can diversify the investments. As of recent, the numbers showed up in Crunchbase last week that the numbers have declined drastically for Black people receiving funding by 70%. And in the city of Atlanta that I reside, Black people are at a decline of 79%. Yes, this is very alarming, especially after June 2nd, 2020, when we saw all of the Black squares take place on social media. We do not see any of that energy currently. My company in particular is backed by JP Morgan Chase, MasterCard, PayPal Ventures, Bank of America, Ally Bank, and so many more that have been silent during this time. But we're very loud, June 2020. Prior to the Fearless Fund's existence, Black women in particular were raising an average of $30,000 for their businesses. After our existence, we came on the scene cutting 7-figure checks. We have raised almost $100 million.
Ooh. But I'm going to give you an applause whether anybody else applauds with me. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. And it is unfortunate that we are experiencing these attacks. They're using litigation as a way to eliminate diversity. We are inaugural defendants of one of the most defining lawsuits of our time. This is not about us. They are literally trying to make what we do day to day by funding women and people of color illegal. In court, the plaintiffs had the audacity to refer to my business as the whites only sign during the segregated period in this country. I said, this is not correct. That sign was used to oppress, and I'm not sure what disparity that sign was used to meet. We are in existence to meet a disparity. Again, we make up over, as women of color, 20% of the US population and receive less than 0.39% of the funding. As everybody has stated here today, diversity is good business. If the only color people are concerned about is green, it makes sense. So that tells me, if the stats say that the mission of oppression and suppression is greater than the mission of making money, which does not add up in a capitalistic society. So my ask here also today, and I know I was supposed to be answering your question, Chairman Waters, but like I said, had I known I had the floor, I would definitely take it all. My ask here today is to get assistance on an offensive strategy. We need policy that protects our access to capital. We need policies that have minority mandates that state that the people in this country will receive access to capital according to the demographics in which they play and exist in this country. We need accountability held for all these corporations making public commitments to the Black community that they have not fulfilled. And though this is not for this panel, we're going to need help legally for counter lawsuits. I'm tired of being on the defensive. It's time to get on the offensive. And that's why I'm here today, and those are my asks.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Before we go to the next panelist for a question, Ms. Sylvia Garcia entered the room. Ms. Garcia, would you like to have a few minutes for an opening statement?
Well, I think in the interest of time, no. But I do want to thank all the panelists and for being here, particularly the investment banker, because I know how hard it is. I was city controller in Houston, and I still remember the first time I walked on the floor, the trading floor there at the stock exchange. A sea of white guys with short sleeve shirts, white shirts, and just a little tie. Y'all are laughing. I'm showing my age, maybe a little bit. But, and then the last time I was there, which was probably maybe 5-6 years ago, not too much has changed. Not too much. There's a few minority men, maybe a few white women, but there's still not enough of us there. So thank you for being here and speaking up. And as a lawyer, I applaud you and do seek out that legal advice, because lawyers can make a lot of good social change. I graduated from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law from a historically Black college in Houston. And that's one thing that he always talked about, was lawyers are for social change. And in this arena, social change is simple. It's access to capital. With that, I yield back.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to move on to our members. First, I'm going to call on Ms. Beatty. When I asked Ms. Beatty if she would take the chairmanship of the subcommittee on diversity and inclusion, she jumped at it. She said, absolutely. Now she eats, sleeps, and breathes DEI. And she has confronted corporate America with questionnaires to find out exactly about who, what, and where is in these corporations, what positions they're in, et cetera, et cetera. She's done a fantastic job. Ms. Beatty, go right ahead.
Thank you so much, and I'll be brief because I know the time is fleeting, but I'd be remiss if I would not say I have followed the work and the research of all four of you. And let me say thank you, because the question, I'll start this way, on policy. As you just said that, something came to mind. A few years ago when we were talking about poverty and how it affected the funding that we get tied into the Census Bureau, Mr. Clyburn came up, as you all remember, with 10, 20, 30. So I would like to work on something and give it back to you. Why can't we do the same thing if we do that breakdown as he did with the percentage of representation or lack of tied to how much we should be able to give in those communities and to those businesses to give us some equity? Because right now, it's zero for all practical purposes in reading your studies in the McKinsey. So I was going to ask the reverse question of what policies would you all like to see us implement? What legislation should we be fighting more of? Because I won't go through all the statistics and what you found out. But let me also say, and today is Delta Day on the heels, and I'd be remiss because Ms. Simone is a Delta. And thank you for your work with the Congressional Black Caucus. And same to you, Ms. Rye. But let me take my last minute and say, it's when you speak out and you do things. And what Ms. Murphy, Attorney Murphy, was making reference to, and she, of course, wouldn't say this sister is one of the baddest lawyers in the United States.
But I have to correct you, play one on TV, but
No, well, exactly. and that's what I like.
I've supervised lawyers for almost 20 years.
That's right, that's right.
So let me reframe that, because your company that does that and was hired because Facebook had not put individuals like you in that space. And we were so proud and so happy. And so when he came in here and I said, well, you know, I was hoping that I could help him. But then I just had to rip him. I had to do a Auntie Maxine on him for that, because he should have been embarrassed not to know what he had right there, which is my point that I'll end on. How do we make sure that we do a better job? Because the first thing we hear is we can't find them. When we're talking about double and triple digit millions of dollars, whether it's someone to be in the C-suite, on the boards, whether it's getting access to capital, they always want to act like we don't qualify and what we can't do. And here's 4 examples right here of why we should be in the room more. So you don't have to answer it now so we can go to someone else. But what I'd like to know is for you all to share with us legislation, partnerships, or what voices do you want us? We took on the business roundtable because of, I'm going to call you speaker now, because of Chairwoman Waters, we're talking about 50 billion above companies couldn't send a designee, had to come into our hearing room and bring data that they had refused to do prior to her letter going from them. So we know we have power, and we know people will do it. So think about how we can use that leadership with Chairwoman Waters so we can say help is on the way. But I just want to say thank you to the 4 of you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Beatty. Now, Mr. Cleaver, who is a member of the committee and chairs one of the subcommittee with housing, comes from a time when he talked about poverty and living in public housing. He served as a mayor, and he's worked with a lot of issues like CDBG, on and on and on. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just respect. Hi, Angela. Ms. Murphy. Thank you. Hi, Angela. It's good to see you. Angela is Angela is like my family. Yeah, like my family. Let me just say you're in the right place, because I mean, you were talking about the issues when you get Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Joyce Beatty, who tried to, but they hate her, and I wasn't supposed to say that. Okay, you know, and the problems are mammoth, but when our chairperson started the diversity committee, it opened up a whole new world, and I think, you know, I think in January we'll be in a position, I think, where Ms. Beatty will be back, and we have a lot of things that we were all working on, and I think she did a magnificent job, and our visionary who did it, I didn't know how it was going to work, but it has, and as I said, they hate her, and so that means hate. That means that you know, she's doing it right. So thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Ms. Williams, I'd like to call on you. Ms. Williams, your sister's from Georgia also, and certainly you got to know each other better and get to understand what she's doing with venture capital. But I want to tell you, this is a young woman who came to our committee absolutely committed, hit the ground running, and is aligned with us in ways that helps us to move whatever we're moving. And when we take back the House, and we're able to put legislation that you're referring to on Biden's desk, it'll be because we have young people like this who joined us and stepped in right away. Thank you, Ms. Williams.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Waters. And y'all, votes have been called, and I'm still a new-ish member, so I get a little nervous when that clock is ticking down. So I will be brief because I came today to listen, but something stuck with me, Ms. Rodriguez. You said we cannot do our opponents' work for them, and that really stuck in my mind, because that is what I wanted to hear more of from a legal strategy and a policy piece. What is it that you need to see so that we are doing our part and not doing our opponents' work for them? That really stuck in my mind today. Yes, I would love to hear about that. Ms. Beatty is tracking the vote, so I'm gonna follow her lead. I get to serve on this committee, y'all, with so much wisdom and leadership, and I take it in every day because not every new member of Congress gets this opportunity, and I am so grateful for what I have learned in just 3 short years on this committee under your leadership, Chairwoman. And so I am here to listen and would love to hear more from you on the strategy and what we need to be doing here as leaders in this space, because we cannot do our opponents' work for them.
Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Williams. We have to go and take a vote, but let me just conclude by saying, first of all, you've got to have the confidence that we can close this wealth gap. You can't be afraid of anybody. You've got to take on whomever and whatever tries to impede our ability to close this wealth gap. We deserve it. We've worked for it. It can happen. So each of you are working in this space in different ways. I appreciate you. I honor you. Let's keep going, and we'll have plenty to put on the president's desk. I mean, President Biden. Yeah. Thank you very much for being here, everybody. Yeah, we have to hurry. Okay. Okay, thank you. I think let's go take this picture. Okay. Yeah.